in from the waiting room. So thank you for your patience as we do this. Let me find. Okay, while we wait for everyone to get in, I just want to say hello and welcome to episode 1 of season 4. We are so excited to be kicking the new year off with our new season. I'm Lindsay Randall, the host of the speaker series, and Digging In is a series of live presentations with scholars from around the country and co-sponsored by the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology and the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We are going to begin with the land acknowledgement for the land that the Peabody Institute and its school, Phillips Academy, are on. Phillips Academy occupies the land of the Pennacook and Patuxet people and the lands of the contemporary Abenaki, Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Wabanaki, Pokanoket, and Nipmuc nations. We honor all Indigenous peoples who are here now and have been here for time immemorial and will be here in the future. We acknowledge Indigenous genocide and the continued oppression of Native peoples, voices, cultures, and spiritualities, and we understand how education has been used by settler institutions in the attempted erasure of Indigenous peoples. We commit to interrogating the histories of and our complicity in colonization, centering Native voices and communities, and dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism at Phillips Academy and beyond. So join us every other Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time through June for our presentations. And for a schedule of dates and presenters, you can visit us at peabody.andover.edu or at the Massachusetts Archaeological Society's Facebook page. And if you are enjoying our programming, please consider expanding your impact by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We are able to bring outstanding programming like this through the support of viewers like you. And so today we are super excited to kick it off with Jennifer Lupu. Jennifer is a doctoral candidate in anthropology at Northwestern University and is a visiting scholar at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Her historical archaeology research has included studies of brothels, medicine use and access, and LGBTQ experiences in the late 19th to early 20th century in Washington, D.C. She was previously a pre-doctoral fellow at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, and her research has been funded by the Smithsonian, the Social Sciences Research Council, and Sexualities Project at Northwestern. During and at the conclusion of the talk, viewers are able to submit questions directly to me via either the chat function or the Q&A function that you see on your Zoom screen. We'll then give our speaker time to answer as many questions as they can, understanding they probably won't get to all of them. So welcome, Jennifer, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me. And I'm going to share my screen now, which hopefully you can see. All right, so I'll just jump in. Thanks again for having me. I'm excited to hear everyone's questions. Today, I'm going to be talking about materials that were excavated from the yard areas of Halcyon House, a large mansion, which you can see depicted here, which is located in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C. Halcyon House, as it has been known since the 19th century, is on the National Register of Historic Places. It was originally built in the late 18th century and has had multiple residents and owners since that time. In 1985, the owner agreed to hire an archaeological firm to excavate the site. When archaeological excavations began, the contracted firm, Engineering Sciences, found many more artifacts and feature deposits than they had predicted, with intact deposits dating back to pre-colonial Native American occupation of the area. However, the vast majority of the artifacts were quite recent, dating from the early 20th century in household trash deposits. In other research, I've been working on cataloging and analyzing materials from earlier occupations of the site, including from enslaved Africans living on the site in the Civil War, but this research is preliminary and still ongoing. And today I'll be focusing on materials that I've cataloged from 2 feature deposits that date from the early 20th century, when the house was owned by a person named Albert Adsit Clemens. Although there were occasional boarders, newspapers from around the time of Clemens's death and neighbors' reports suggest that for most of his ownership, spanning 1900 to 1938, Clemens lived at Halcyon House with only a male carpenter, whose name is unknown. Described in historic newspapers as reclusive and eccentric, Albert Clemens's trash tells a more detailed story of his life. He and the carpenter were both listed as men in documents, but the trash deposit is full of metal clips from corsets, garters, stockings, and other lingerie items marketed exclusively to women, along with East Asian imported porcelains, numerous intact glass bottles, particularly numerous alcohol bottles, and a sample of powder labeled by the original archaeologists as possible theater makeup. And here at the top, you see a bottle with remains of an Orinoco rye whiskey from 1900s to 1910s pre-Prohibition Washington, and a number of other artifacts from the site. One of the ones I want to highlight, particularly the one at the bottom, I initially thought it might be part of a very unusual tobacco pipe because it's unglazed on the interior and it's about that size. However, I was at a Society for Historical Archaeology conference and met another archaeologist who actually collects these items. And what they are is they are these miniature beer steins that had anti-prohibition, pro-drinking culture sentiments that would be worn as like a little charm or in a buttonhole to indicate that you were in favor of drinking culture. I don't know exactly what this one says, but a common saying was, a camel can go a day without a drink, but that's no life. And here it says something can go something a day, that's no something. So it's probably something along those lines. And there are numerous of these that you can find nowadays in antique stores that all have different little sayings on them, generally in favor of drinking culture. One I found says, I won't be home till morning, or things like that. And then there's some other materials from the site, and I'll discuss some of these more in depth throughout the talk. So trash collection was readily available in Georgetown by this time, but Clemens chose instead to discard these items in backyard trash deposits, perhaps to keep them secret from prying neighbors' eyes. Clemens and the carpenter renovated and remodeled the house, building a theater, an elaborate ballroom, and an outdoor stage, along with more unusual features, including stairways that led nowhere and doors that opened onto walls. So here's a picture of Elizabeth Crowell, one of the original archaeologists who now she works at the Fairfax Parks Authority as an archaeologist. And she shared with me this photo of her working on the site in the 80s. And also here's a map of the various test units that were excavated. Almost all of them had feature deposits. So although the artifacts were excavated in 1985, the project lost funding midway through due to a dispute between the archaeological firm and the landowner. They ended up going to court and suing each other back and forth, and artifact cataloging was never completed and a report was never written. Nothing has ever been published on this site. The artifacts basically had remained in boxes, largely unexplored, for over 30 years until I began the initial recataloging of the artifacts during the summer of 2017. And here you can see how these artifacts got to the DC Historic Preservation Office. A volunteer was doing research for the city archaeologist, looking at collections from DC, and had heard about the excavations at Halcyon House that had occurred. She was doing this research in 2010. She called the developer asking if the artifacts were still stored somewhere. And the developer basically said, as a matter of fact, we're about to throw them away. And if you want them, come get them. So the city archaeologist and the volunteer drove over and picked up the boxes and then did a quick rehouse and put them into archival boxes, but didn't have time to do a full catalog of the materials. There are over 30 boxes that include All the artifacts from the site bagged by provenience, along with documentary research and as well as field forms, site profiles, test unit descriptions, and all sorts of information that allow me to sort of reconstruct some about the site. So as I'm going to, when I first started working with this, there were rumors that the artifacts related to someone who was gay, but there were a lot of questions about how do you identify sexuality in the archaeological record? Is it even possible? Would the documents yield the information? And as I'm going to discuss, this question is both kind of problematic and it's also difficult to answer based on the collected evidence. If we treat everyone in the past as straight until proven otherwise, we'll end up with a very inaccurate view of the past. So instead of trying to definitively determine the sexual and gendered practices of Clemens specifically, I instead seek to disrupt heteronormative assumptions around gendered objects by starting with the claim that this is a queer assemblage and exploring the ways that that queerness manifests. And in this talk, I'm going to talk through the context of queer DC in the Prohibition era, as well as go through a number of the artifacts from the site. I'm primarily going to be discussing artifacts that came from features 18 and 19, both of which were found in the same test unit, Unit 7. These two features lie adjacent to one another, although along the west wall profile, feature 19 runs atop part of feature 18. Features 21 and 22, which are not fully cataloged yet, also seem to contain material from the early 20th century period, and they are also within this unit. Each of these is distinguished primarily by soil color and texture, and the artifacts are pretty similar across them. So I think most likely this represents one trash deposit with multiple dump events. It also appears that in some cases, new pits were dug into existing trash deposits and refilled with household trash, as is in the case of feature 21, which cuts into feature 18. According to a site map, all of these features were found underneath a patio surface, which runs under a wall that was constructed by Albert Clemens. Although boarders and lessees occupied the house at various times, none of them stayed for longer than a year. It's very unlikely that they would have accumulated the quantity of trash found in these deposits, and further unlikely that they would have chosen to bury trash rather than disposing of it through the city's collection services, which by this point were well established. Clemens was a collector of antiques, as evidenced by a 72-page inventory of his possessions at the time of his death. The material in these features stylistically matches many of the items in Clemens' probate inventory, also indicating that they likely belong to him. Now, some of the documentary ambiguity comes from the fact that Clemens married a woman, Elizabeth White, while both he and Elizabeth were in their 40s. The marriage occurred shortly after Elizabeth's mother died, and I think it's possible that this was what's called a lavender marriage, intended to allow Elizabeth to obtain her inheritance. Although Clemens was technically married, his wife continued to reside at her late mother's home on New Hampshire Avenue in Washington, D.C., and in 1920, that residence included a woman named Mary Stevens, who is described in her relationship to the head of household as her companion. Although Albert is also listed as residing at New Hampshire Avenue at various points in time, other newspaper sources and neighbors' reports claim that he was at Halcyon. And finally, in his last will and testament, Clemens wrote, quote, "To my wife, Elizabeth White Clemens, who has ample independent means, I leave grateful love and affection for many years of kindness and friendly interest and assistance." And although he had some financial wealth and materials, he didn't leave any of these to Elizabeth. Instead, these were donated to various museums, sold off, and the collective went to Harvard University, which is also unusual because Clemens seems to have no connection to Harvard. So while it is impossible to know the exact nature of Albert and Elizabeth's relationship, these documents suggest, at the very least, that they did not have a traditional interdependent heterosexual lifestyle. Although an array of materials exist, of documentary materials exist that mention Clemens, the documents written in the past are steeped in heteronormativity and don't quite present him as a queer figure. So we will likely never understand or know exactly how Albert saw himself, or about the intimate details of Albert's relationship with the carpenter, or the full truth of Albert's historic sexual and gendered behaviors. So instead, I am going to talk about how I think about queerness and queer theory in this case. Today, we often talk about coming out of the closet as a way of revealing one's gender and sexuality, using usually specifically a gender or sexual practice that is in some ways seen as normative. But during the 1920s and 30s, gay non-conforming people would instead colloquially say that they were taking off a public mask. This refers to a repeated act of concealing in public and revealing in private, or among certain, or revealing yourself among certain trusted community, among loved ones or friends. As a current fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard, I have been reading Hannah Arendt's theory. And she writes in her final work, The Life of the Mind, about how we live in a world of appearances. We judge and understand one another to some degree based on presentation, on our words and choices, and our outside appearance. But we as humans are much more than just what we appear to be. And Arendt argues that we have a desire to be seen. She complicates and writes against Descartes' classic assertion that I think, therefore I am, and argues that we are more than just our thoughts, more complicated than our actions, but that there is meaning in our engagement in the world and our connections to one another. So in this presentation, I experiment with some of the ways that we talk about research in an effort to queer the form of archaeological knowledge. I follow Martin Monolansong on messy itineraries of queerness, incorporating music, storytelling, speculation, and participant insights gleaned through doing community-based research. My community-based research includes public talks and forums where participants give me feedback on what they want to see of the research. I also conducted open lab days where participants worked with the artifacts and learned about archaeological analysis. And I co-created a LGBTQ creative writing workshop. I co-created it with a performance studies scholar, Benjamin Zender. During the workshop, which was on a Saturday at a DC Public Library before COVID and was advertised to anyone who wanted to attend, we got about 10 attendees, I believe. And here are pictures of the attendees, each with an artifact they chose, shared with participant permission. I presented a basic overview of the Halcyon site and the story of Albert Clemens and helped select the artifacts that we used. And then Benjamin Zender created prompts for creative writing exercises based off the materials from the collection. And I'm going to include some of what the participants wrote later on in this talk. In a way, archaeological analyses of household trash allow us to unmask the stereotyped narratives of the past to better understand the realities of everyday life, the truth of individual struggle, the secrets that people keep hidden, perhaps due to stigma, due to choice, due to fear, or due to needs for their own safety. I follow Arendt on the pursuit of meaning over truth, and which blurs the temporal boundaries between past and present. I intentionally deprioritize a pursuit of the past as it was, instead asking, how can we use material objects to mobilize new historical narratives that uplift and support queer voices and lives in the present day? I take an intentional ambivalence lived practices and avoid claiming or asserting that any specific identity label was correct or accurate. Instead, I begin from the possibilities of gender nonconformity and follow it through context and artifacts to explore associated meanings and speculative potentialities. What would artifacts such as a lingerie pin and a corset clip mean socially and personally had Clemens worn them on his body? I claim Clemens as queer, both to explore the possibilities of his gender nonconformity as well as to explore his strangeness and oddness more generally. In doing so, I quote, following Halpern, I quote, recruit the queerness of past historical periods, not in order to justify one or another partisan model of gay life in the present, but rather to acknowledge, promote, and support a heterogeneity of queer identities, past and present. And I also am thinking with Conkey and Spector in that they write, by projecting gender stereotypes from the present onto past materials, archaeologists can sometimes, quote, present a picture of continuity in gender arrangements and ideology from early humans to the present, a continuity that suggests an inevitability, if not the immutability of the sphere of social life. And as Barbara Voss points out, quote, human sexuality was as richly varied as in the past as it is in the present day, so much so that current theories of human sexuality may be inadequate to characterize past social relationships and sexual identities. So what is queer? What does it mean to be queer? As a queer identified woman myself, what does it mean to be queer is a question I've personally engaged with as I explored my own identity and sexuality, a question I've discussed with family and chosen family, and a source of connection with the people I broadly consider to be my community. It leads to a complicated web of questions for archaeologists. What does it mean to be queer in the past? How far into the past does queer community extend? Does queer heritage exist? And if so, how do we recognize it? How can we study gender nonconforming and non-binary people in the past? I use queer as multiply meaningful in this talk. As odd, strange, different, or eccentric, a use that has been around since the 1500s. As a theoretical construct that can deconstruct heteronormative assumptions. As a contemporary category for sexuality and gender. And as a term used in Clemens' era to represent both difference generally, as well as gender nonconformity. Rather than thinking about queering the past, I think about this project as using a queer positionality to read the often overlooked or ignored queerness of the past. And I quote from Ann Stoller, quote, reading here is an agentive act, one squarely focused on what we know and how we know it, end quote. Although we may actively queer our interpretation or reading of the past, queerness exists in the past, whether we notice it or not. As a queer woman myself, I was drawn to this collection by my own queerness in relationship to queer fasts, finding along with Barbara Voss that, quote, the sensual experience of handling and caring for artifacts may be an entry point for self-reflexive curation methodologies. My queer methodological approach to the collection is formed both through reading queer theory and sexuality studies literatures, as well as through my own queer positionality in relationship to the artifacts and to the responses of LGBTQ+ participants at my talks and various events. So I want to talk a little bit about pronouns. Some historians, especially recently, have pushed for scholars to use they, them pronouns for any historical actor for whom a gender identity is uncertain. I would argue that if we're going to do that, we should refer to every single actor in the past with they, them pronouns. Choosing to assign these pronouns to all actors who may have identified as LGBTQ+ or who have some element of gender nonconformity in their record can be homogenizing and in some ways othering. And I've engaged with some transgender men and transgender women that have stated that their pronouns are he, her, he, him, or she, her, but not they, them. Some people have a preference and say, my pronouns are she, her, they are not they, them. Meanwhile, non-binary participants I've had may use they, them as gender neutral pronouns, or they may express a preference for other less common pronouns such as zir or pers, or request that a specific name be used in place of any pronouns at all. During the 19th and 20th centuries, the little documentation we have suggests that sometimes he, him, and she, her were interchangeably used for the same individual as a mark of gender nonconformity. But as Barbara Voss points out, present-day sexual taxonomies, such as the categorizing of all those who have sex with members of the same gender as homosexual, began to develop in the late 19th century and may be anachronistic in other contexts. So there's this difficulty with categories and with pronouns. And of course, many of the terms that were used at the time are quite offensive and are not terms that I want to use. So instead of sticking to one particular format, I want to note that the identity labels I use, as well as the pronouns I use throughout this talk, cannot fully encapsulate how any individual saw themselves or their gender in the past. Because I don't have records that tell me exactly how Albert and the carpenter saw themselves in their own words, I'm intentionally leaving room for multiple possibilities, recognizing that LGBTQ plus people in the present often do not see themselves represented in history in any way. While our knowledge of this past will always be incomplete, from the present, we can claim queer and trans ancestors, recognizing that when people pushed the boundaries and lived as themselves in the past, it paved the way for future generations of LGBTQ people to continue to fight for the rights to live openly. Throughout the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th, I found in my research many newspaper reports of people who are arrested for dressing in attire that did not match their socially assigned gender. In many cases, individuals who were arrested were described as, quote, men in, quote, female attire, including corsets, although on rare occasions, quote, women dressed in, quote, male attire were also arrested. And additionally, I want to note that racially biased policing has a long history in Washington, D.C., and newspaper sources from this era suggest that individuals and communities described as, quote, Black or Negro faced more intensive policing, and especially faced more intensive policing around socially stigmatized sexual practices. In my earlier research, studying brothels in the late 1880s and 1890s in Washington, D.C., I came across several other figures in documents, one of whom I want to mention now, named Cora Strauss. Cora Strauss was a madam, and her brothel was located at 1219 East Street Northwest along Slate Alley, and it was a particularly eventful location, according to newspaper reports. Although she was white, she was not well off, and although she did not face any criminal penalties for a sex work related crime, there were other reports relating to her in the newspapers. In 1887, a man named James Turner stole some dresses from a resident of her house, resulting in a trial. The brothel's residents were witnesses at the trial, and newspaper coverage of the event suggests that their occupation was universally known. But again, they weren't being on trial for prostitution or anything like that. So the day of the trial, the Washington Critic newspaper ran a brief article, which you can see here, titled "Cora Strauss, a Man." The article states simply, in the trial of James Turner today for stealing some silk dresses from the house of Cora Strauss, a person of unsavory reputation, it was disclosed that she is no less than Cornelius Isidore Schultz. Despite these claims and this outing of Cora, she is later discussed in newspaper articles with she, her pronouns. And she's also listed in the census as female. In her will, in her last will and testament, she names herself Cornelia Isadora Schultz, a feminized version of what was perhaps her birth name. While Cora repeatedly chose to use a female name and she, her pronouns with much less privilege than Albert, Albert Clemens chose to keep his given name and his will and to use he, him pronouns publicly. This is not to say that Cora would have identified as a transgender woman, while Albert was more akin to a drag queen. Rather, I use the pronouns each actor seemed to use for themselves when they were able to choose. And I emphasize again that we can know how each person saw themselves or their gender or sexuality, and that people vary beyond the binaries of female, male, and heterosexual, homosexual. Excuse me. Although queer life in American cities, particularly New York, has been previously studied, Washington, D.C. until recently was unknown as a site of queer placemaking in this period. However, recent research from Channing Joseph uncovered the story of William Dorsey Swann, a formerly enslaved person who lived in Washington, D.C. in the 1870s and 80s and was known to have held some of the earliest drag balls. Swann's experiences are largely known about due to articles describing police raids of events. And from these, we know that William Dorsey Swann was perhaps the first person to coin the term drag queen or queen of the drag back in the 1880s. And Channing Joseph's book is currently in press and should be coming out later this year. So I encourage in the movement and other reformers succeeded in passing morality forms that criminalized all such persons who lead a notoriously lewd or lascivious course of life. As prohibition pushed alcohol out of the public sphere, queer spaces, which already tended to be secretive or underground, commonly became speakeasies or venues for secret alcohol consumption. Drag ball scenes and queer nightlife are well documented in New York City and reported in newspapers from other cities and towns as well. In these spaces were often racially segregated across cities. For example, in New York, we know that there was a scene in Greenwich Village and another in Harlem. And in performances and gender-bending attire flourished. One of the resources on this is the work done by Chauncey in the book Gay New York. However, such queer spaces are almost completely unstudied in Washington, D.C. during Prohibition. However, sometime in the early 20th century, Clemens and the Carpenter built a lavish ballroom, an attached theater, and a backyard stage. Halcyon House have been the site of a queer performance scene during this time. One of the most extensive resources for insights about gay and queer life in early 20th century Washington are the published portions of Charles Newman-Buehler's journal, in which he discusses his sexual encounters with other men and his experiences in the gay community of 1920s Washington. Buehler described encounters, parties, and outings of various sorts, including cruising. But throughout the journal, tensions emerge around sexuality and gender performances, and Buehler repeatedly struggles with hate and disgust pointed toward his own sexuality and more explicitly toward the few gender non-conforming characters and encounters mentioned in the text. And I will mention that there is a very brief mention of a Victorian style house in Georgetown with rented rooms that could be referring to Halcyon House from this journal. But in one of the accounts of the journal from May 4th, 1928, Buehler describes an outing to the theater to see The Enemy of the People with some friends. He writes, quote, "We had arranged to meet Isidore and Junior in front of the theater. It upset me exceedingly to recognize not only Isidore, but also Junior hurrying toward us in, quote, costume. Junior looked exactly like a girl. I looked meaningfully from him to Isidore and said flatly, 1 is more than enough. They carried on all the way up to the gallery." And so this entry demonstrates a few different things. One, it indicates that people dressed in gender nonconforming ways in public spaces, such as the theater and the street. And it also indicates that just because someone has non-heterosexual sexual preferences or encounters doesn't necessarily mean that that individual is accepting of all forms of sexual and gender difference, as we see in the present, where we see transphobia in gay communities. Another point of evidence of queerness in the 1920s is this song entitled Masculine Women, Feminine Men, written by Edgar Leslie. This song references a breaking down of gender roles through objects. And I'm going to play a little bit of it for you. And it has some clips of various different silent movies and things from this era.
Hey, hey, women are going mad today. Hey, fellas are just as bad, I'll say. Go anywhere, just stand and stare. You'll say they're bugs when you look at the clothes they wear. Masculine women, feminine men, which is the rooster, which is the hen? It's hard to tell them apart today and say, sister is busy learning to shave, brother just loves his permanent wave. It's hard to tell them apart today. Hey, hey, girls were girls and boys were boys when I was a top. Now we don't know who is who or even what's what. Knickers and trousers, baggy and wide. Nobody knows who's walking inside those masculine women and feminine men.
And so this song is further evidence that there are queer and gender nonconforming people living their lives, living as themselves during this era. So we also see that during the early 20th century, gendered practices changed and styles became more fluid, and people were using clothing and other adornment items to queer their appearances. So using the materials from Halcyon House in the case of Albert Clemens, I ask, how did people historically adorn their bodies to index queerness and perform a queer aesthetic? How were these adornment items made meaningful through queer performances? I am looking at a piece of red lamp glass. One writing workshop participant wrote, quote, the light that would be spread outward through the globe would cast a pink or red glow on the surroundings. This would allow people who inhabited the room or hallway to also have a reddish glow, eliciting a sense of healthiness. The red glow might encourage or influence the activity that was taking place beneath or next to it. Newspapers report that the theater built during Clemens' residence at Halcyon House was never used. However, the next owner happened to discover a secret door disguised from the outside to look like window shades, leading through twisting stairs and passageways up to the third floor theater. And here you can see the interior of the theater that was torn down after Albert's residence, and you can see the door that looked like window shades. So imagine that it's 1917 and prohibition laws have just been passed in Washington, D.C., 3 years before they're passed in the rest of the country. Perhaps you've heard about a queer party in Georgetown and decide you're going to attend. Following a friend's instructions, you turn up 34th Street and start climbing the steep hill toward the looming house known as Halcyon. You find the old window blinds, just as described, and slip inside unnoticed. Entering a dark, winding passageway with many possible wrong turns, perhaps you would see a string of oil lamps lighting your way. Unlike quotidian lamps, these lamps are covered by elaborate red globes, casting flickering scarlet shadows along the passageway. Finally, you emerge in the theater where throngs of sweaty bodies mingle and touch. The elaborately dressed bodies in the room defy traditional gendered dress, with an explosion of color, texture, and sparkle, combining articles and items not usually grouped together around a single body. Trending in queer fashion today are small enamel pins fixed onto bags, jackets, and shirt collars. When I notice such pins on a person on the train, we might make eye contact, briefly smile and nod in recognition, and carry on wordlessly. After brunch with a friend one day, we went to a small shop to buy matching friendship pins, choosing ones that featured a small cupped hand with red and gold mushrooms growing from it. To me, it signifies more than just our friendship. representing the idea that by nurturing the parts of yourself that society has said are dirty, dark, or unnatural, you can create beautiful new lives as mushrooms grow from darkness to become delicate but hardy members of our world. The trash from Clemens' residence included 2 small pins, both missing the enameling that once gave them color and design. These pins are known as lingerie pins and were used to hold the straps of brassieres together so they wouldn't slide off the shoulder into view. Archaeologically, these 2 pins are extremely useful because one of them, the one at the bottom, has a new style of clasp and is imprinted with a patent date of April 1910. The other pin has an older clasp, which helps to reliably date the disposal of these artifacts to sometime after 1910, probably between 1910 and 1920. A 1912 newspaper article states, quote, "The woman whose fetish is daintiness will hail with delight at a new device on the inexpensive counter, a lingerie pin, flat and inconspicuous." I imagine the carpenter carefully choosing the pins from his and Albert's shared jewelry box and affixing them to adorn his body. Small, unnoticeable to most, the cold metal might touch his skin, sending a shiver of delight at the reminder of the small precious item, carefully chosen, now a part of an individual queer assemblage that is shaped around and with his body, changing it, becoming real, becoming a truer, more intimate self. A writing workshop participant wrote of this object, quote, "I imagine that Albert's wife would have gifted him with the mid-range bottle of perfume, very floral and sweet, as a cheeky anniversary gift. Perhaps each morning, Albert would take a moment to remove the stopper, be overcome by the pungent smell, and roll the glass applicator across his wrist. As he inhaled, he would reflect on his limited privileged freedom to, at least in his own home, feel a little more at home in his body. Setting the applicator down, he would feel the alcohol evaporate from his worn skin, leaving only the purest essence of flowers and Albert behind." One of the metal clasps in the Clemens trash deposit was inscribed with the brand name Nemo Triple Strip, which was a corset brand that catered to, quote, "stout women," and manufactured an unusually wide variety of sizes. According to one advertisement from 1910, quote, "Nearly every woman knows that Nemo's self-reducing corsets roll a fleshy figure into graceful lines, ensuring comfort and health. With its patented extra strong elastic, Nemo corsets would also make sense for someone hoping to remold a body seen as male into a new silhouette. We might imagine Albert positioning the corset around his waist, a friend pulling tight on the strings and straps. The fabric and boning in the corset reshapes the form of Albert's torso into hourglass lines, an effective act of becoming." Although neighborhood rumors alleged that Clemens and the carpenter were known for throwing lavish parties, few details of these remain. One event, however, was covered in several newspapers. Imagine it is May of 1919. A record-breaking virus pandemic has just swept through the nation in 3 brutal waves, known as the Spanish influenza. For months, the influenza and its casualties had been on the front page of every newspaper. Events were canceled, people began wearing protective face masks, and the scientific community focused its full attention on understanding the disease and finding a cure. Excuse me. After a particularly difficult winter, the waves of the virus seemed to have subsided, and people were beginning to gather again. It was a moment similar to the spring of 2021, a few months of spring and summer before our virus and resurged again in the fall and winter. If you lived in Washington, D.C. at this time, you might see a newspaper advertisement for the Sundays, a Japanese mask, an outdoor benefit gala and party at Halcyon House scheduled for mid-May. Perhaps you decide to purchase a ticket only to be disappointed as rainy weather led the event to be postponed several times. Finally, on its evening in May of 1919, a team of Tears and works on the extravagance of how Japanese themed decor. Colorful lanterns hung throughout the terrace garden, dangling above the bushes, the tangled bushes and pathways, backed by the old Georgian mansion known as Halcyon House. The garden led down to an outdoor stage framed by a magnificent vista across the Potomac River and into the lights and forests of Virginia. Dozens of guests gathered in this picturesque setting for a benefit party and performance of the Japanese mask. Quote, "It was a glorious party and everyone was reluctant to leave," lauded a journalist in attendance. The guest list was odd and eclectic. A prominent Japanese statesman, a Venezuelan diplomat and his sister, a cast of theater actors from across the city, so-called society women, and the host of the affair, Albert Adsit Clemens. A few days later, a full-page spread in the Evening Star newspaper showcased the performers' attire. If you looked closely, you might notice the gender-bending disconnect between bodies and garments of some performers. Photographs and accounts from the event tell of numerous society girls dressed in kimonos and imported fabric, but no accounts describe Albert that night. Perhaps Albert slipped in and out of the crowd, unrecognized as anyone other than an anonymous woman in an elaborate costume. As I sat in the DC Historic Preservation Office in 2017, I looked through my notes to find the location of an effect that had intrigued me. A small clip, probably from a corset, inscribed with a lotus flower. As I held this month's corset clip, nearly 100 years after it had last been worn, I wondered about the small object's journey through time. What stories could it tell if only it could speak? The clip most likely lived a full object life during the early 20th century. It probably circulated as a commodity before coming into someone's life as a purchase or gift. It was almost certainly worn on someone's body because the teeth where it once gripped elastic were rounded and worn. And eventually it was thrown away as trash. Was this small trinket a guest at the sun goddess mask, hiding under fabric pressed against flesh? Perhaps Albert's hand grasped this object as he threw it into the trash pile, assuming it would never be touched again. And yet, the object has been exhumed and lives a new and very different life. It touches new hands and exists in a new world, unimaginably different from the one in which it was discarded. And thank you for having me. And here's some additional further reading if people are interested. And that concludes my talk. I look forward to any questions that people have.
Well, thank you. That was excellent. Yeah, so people, you can type in any questions either into the chat or the Q&A function. I want to start with, what was you said you kind of had heard some stuff about this collection prior to working on it. What was the most surprising thing that you found?
Yeah, so what I'd heard about this collection was that there were sort of rumors about Clemens being gay. I did an oral history with one of the archaeologists on the site, and she said even in the 1980s, there were rumors that he was like this flamboyant character. And these newspaper articles from around his death tell all these stories about Albert as a character. There was one that claimed that he had built secret passageways through the walls, and like a male tenant had only been there for a week because he was like spying on him. And then there was also a claim that he had several Egyptian mummies and sarcophagi in his backyard, and he would tell passersby that they were like to remind him of his long lost youth, which to me is like reads as very queer. But I really tried to track down whether these sarcophagi and these mummies existed and where they went. As I said, a bunch of his things were donated to various museums. He donated, there was one of the only copies of a book of a play by a gay playwright was from Albert's collection, is now the only existing copy of that in the Library of Congress. And so there are all these like there's all these ways that his materials have been distributed out into the world. But I didn't really expect to find such indicators of drag and gender nonconformity. The rumors were that he was gay, that he lived with this carpenter, that he was this sort of quirky person. And then I found out that he was like married to a woman, and I was like, maybe I'm wrong. But as I kept going through, like it does really seem that these materials belong to Albert. And so, and like I said, we know for a fact that there were gender nonconforming and queer people in Washington at this time. So this is probably one of the most likely archaeological cases that's ever been excavated that points to this sort of queer history. So it's been a sort of long journey to get to this point. There was another archaeologist who worked on the site in the 80s who also had heard about the gay history and published a piece in the Washington Blade, which is a gay newspaper, seeking information and insights about it. And you know, there's also all this this element of excavating a possibly queer site in the 1980s during the height of the AIDS epidemic, when being openly gay is very stigmatized, perhaps more stigmatized in the 1980s than it was in the 1920s. And so, yeah, I think it complicates the way that we see queer history and queer past, which is really interesting and exciting. So yeah, there have been a lot of surprises.
Excellent. So another question is, how do you have any recommendations or, you know, things that people should do, especially if you were working in like, say, CRM or other kind of archaeology, in how you might queer or look at collections using sort of a queer theory when it's not so academic? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we as archaeologists tend to, and this goes along with a lot of early sort of gender archaeology, with assigning gender to objects. And if you see materials from a corset, you assume that it was related to a woman. And if you, especially if you have a historical record that says there's like a male head of household, a woman and some kids, you assume, well, the corset was hers and the suspenders were his. But that's not always the case. And leaving that room for possibility of, I mean, I think there's all sorts of people throughout our lifetimes that we've seen evidence of, people who live closeted lives or people who live open lives, but even their close friends and family don't necessarily know. So I think that archaeologists should be leaving room for queer possibilities and also sort of complicate these assumptions about what an object means for gender, and the link between gender and material objects.
Okay. Another question related to the adorable little beer stein thing. Was there any other objects that you had found that you couldn't identify, or, you know, misidentified and had another, or was this like the only one that was like this, you know, kind of interesting thing you learned from the conference or whatever?
Yeah, no, so that artifact, I'll go back to that slide. So that artifact it was really puzzling me for a while, and I was really excited to come across someone who knew more about it. And
archaeologists, we're weird, man. We have really niche things.
Absolutely. There were also a lot of like corset clips and different things like that, you know, some of these metal artifacts were conserved by the early archaeologists and some of them were very rusty. So I wasn't sure what they were. And in fact, I wasn't really sure what some of the corset clips were, they were clearly clothing fasteners of some sort, until I found that Nemo branded one. Because as soon as you see the Nemo, I Googled, or not Googled, but I looked through archives of historic newspapers for advertisements for the brand Nemo, and it was only corsets. That's what they made. So that was definitely a corset clip. And so that indicated to me that the other clips of similar shape, even if they didn't have that logo on them, were also likely from corsets. Another artifact is, you see in the bottom right corner, is Pond's cold cream, which is still marketed today. And I was actually a really great engagement with women at our open lab days. She got really excited and she said, oh my gosh, I still use Pond's cold cream. Now it has like a green plastic lid, but it looks exactly the same. And I didn't realize that this type of heavy, thick cold cream was often used for removing makeup, removing heavy makeup. That's one of its common uses. And there are like dozens of these little Pond's cold cream things from Halcyon House. So learning that they were often used for makeup removal also sort of tracks with this history. And then there's a number of different bottles of like the one on the top right is an extract bottle. And at this time, the company was making like food extracts, like peppermint extract and flavoring extracts, but these extracts often had a high alcohol content. And so during Prohibition, some of these food extracts were sort of drunk as a way of getting alcohol. And we also find dozens of these Sawyer's extract bottles at the Halcyon House site. I see there's a question in the Q&A.
Yep, that just came in.
It says, knowing how conservative archaeology departments can be, how is your research received by your peers and your superiors? I have been extremely fortunate to have a lot of support and enthusiasm from my peers and my department and the various places where I've worked, including the DC Historic Preservation Office. There are some other queer theorists and queer archaeologists in my department at Northwestern. And my advisor, although he doesn't directly work on queer history, has been really excited about my project since the beginning. I actually pitched a project more relating to brothels and the history of sex work, which was what my master's work was on. And I have a couple articles on that. So that's what I came into the program with. But then I started working with Halcyon, and it's started to redirect my research. And I've continued to sort of redirect because now I'm sort of putting Halcyon in context of the broader city, looking at patterns of bottle glass around Prohibition and around the regulation of medicine. I've had a lot of support in having in changing my project over time and in following these sort of like queer pathways. I'm certain that not everyone likes my research. And at one of my early public talks, I had an attendee who said, I think everyone in the audience who's straight is really hoping you're wrong about Albert Clemens. I was kind of shocked and a little taken aback because hoping I'm wrong is very sort of strong language. And I have changed my talk since then to state that even if I am wrong about whether Clemens specifically put these objects on his body, we know that there were queer and gender non-conforming people in this time. We know that trans people have existed ever since the categories male and female have existed. There are people who feel they don't fit into them, who have felt that they're assigned one, they belong in the other, or felt like they don't belong in either, or they have elements of both. There's all sorts of complicated ways that throughout time, people have seen gender and sexuality in different contexts, and the gender binary is a pretty recent social creation, and it doesn't align perfectly with biology either. There's no clear binary in biology either. So I think that is something that is important to me to talk about. And as a teacher and an educator, I do sometimes come across participants and students and community members who are uncomfortable with some of the things I say. And I think that that's all the more reason for me to say them and for people to sit with their discomfort. And I am not quite done with my PhD. I'm going to be on the job market soon. So we'll see if it helps me or hurts me in finding a longer term position. But so far, there's been a lot of enthusiasm. I felt very,
I will say, I feel like academia is more accepting of this, you know, like the question about the CRM and stuff, right? Like, I feel like that's harder, you know, because it kind of trickles down sometimes, these changes in how archaeologists think about things.
yeah.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Those were the questions that we had. And thank you to our viewers for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next lecture, which is going to be on Wednesday, February 9th. And we're going to be joined by Dr. Heather McLeod-Leslie from Canada, international speaker this time, who will be speaking about her collaborative work as an archaeologist with the Mi'kmaq tribe and with descendant African communities. So again, we rely on the support of viewers like you, so consider supporting our outreach by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. And have a wonderful Wednesday. And if you live in the Northeast, good luck with the storm. So, but okay, bye everyone.